Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our 6 p.m. Eastern presentation. Our last speaker before we get to our closing remarks will be Kevin Wong, who will be presenting today on The Ancient's Guide to Esports Production, Manufacturing the Spirit of Competition from Antiquity to League of Legends. Kevin, we're looking forward to this. Take it away.
Well, yeah, thank you for having me. So, hello everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to give a big thanks to the organizers of this conference. Managing a 3-day around-the-clock event is a massive logistical undertaking, and they've done an incredible job. I'm Kevin Wong, and I'm a PhD candidate in classics at Harvard University. This presentation might be a bit of a different flavor from most of the others at this conference, coming as it does from the humanities, and more specifically, the study of Greek and Roman antiquity. In my research, I explore how antiquity has shaped and continues to shape online gaming culture. The response I tend to get when I first bring up my work has often involved some variation on, oh, you must mean Hades or God of War. These games that explicitly adapt Greco-Roman mythology and history are perhaps the most explicit instances of where games and antiquity intersect, and there's a lot of fantastic work that's being done in that area. Personally, however, I've always been more interested in how antiquity provides a frame for thinking about gaming more broadly as a social phenomenon, and by this I mean the way it frames how we play games together, how we discuss and talk about games, how we create and market games, and of course, the subject of today's talk, how we compete through games. In this presentation, I will discuss how Greek and Roman antiquity has been invoked as a means of legitimizing esports as it was developing into the ambitious mass media entertainment it is today. As a case study, I'll be referring to the quintessential esports title, League of Legends by Riot Games. And since its first World Championship in 2011, the game has profoundly shaped the production, scale, and vision of esports. Riot's success at cultivating League's esports scene can be traced in large part to a robust and intricate media strategy. By this point, they've made use of every facet of new media: music, television, streaming, social media, augmented reality, all in service of generating and sustaining an ethos of competition. Yet, relying on different kinds of media to cultivate competition and turn it into a form of cultural entertainment is not new. The Greeks had circuits of athletic competitions and developed entire systems and economies of sculpture, art, and poetry to support that culture. Likewise, the Romans, as they staged their gladiatorial games in massive arenas, relied on all forms of technology and advertisement to market those spectacles across the empire. Today, esports represents what is obviously a much more modern, digitized, and global form of entertainment. Yet, by looking back at these analogs from the past, they might perhaps shed some light on the timeless mechanics of cultural production that apply both then and now. More than that, I would argue that taking inspiration from the past is a strategy that is actively being used and to great success by some of the biggest game studios out there, including Riot Games. Before I dive fully into League, let's pull the brakes for a second to tackle an important question. Why, given that we have more recent cultural practices like traditional sports, would esports producers bother looking all the way back to antiquity for inspiration? Indeed, in the earliest days of esports, I would say that antiquity was hardly relevant at all. The phenomena we call competitive gaming has, over several decades, embarked on a long search for an identity, experimenting with different formulations in order to figure out one that works, one that can sustain itself with steady viewership, organizational investment, and a supply of skilled talent willing to dedicate themselves to its pursuit. T.L. Taylor has offered a useful breakdown of the history of competitive gaming, dividing it into three waves. The first wave, game, has to do with the emergence of informal communities around competitive gaming. We might associate this with arcade culture, grassroots competitions, and early cyber cafe culture, something reminiscent of the image at the top right. During its second wave, as the name esports suggests, the practice actively modeled itself after physical sports and the Olympics. The image at the bottom right, taken from 2010's World Cyber Games, is a good example of this. Finally, the third wave, which started roughly around 2011, was enabled by the advent of Twitch. The growth of broadcasting and streaming saw competitive gaming reformulated as a form of media entertainment, essentially an elaborate form of content to be produced for mass online audiences. Catching this broadcasting wave, esports titles like League rapidly scaled up their events. Rather than simply providing a centralized venue for top teams in the world to compete, these events would soon become the centerpiece of a large-scale media spectacle designed to be broadcast worldwide. Strobe lights, music, CGI, informative overlays, commentators, and increasingly larger LED screens were brought in to generate hype. By this point, studios like Riot Games were no longer in the business of just making games, they were in the business of creating spectacle. Given these cultural and commercial ambitions, the old sports-based framing just wasn't going to cut it. They needed a new aesthetic for the pursuit and consumption of competitive esports. I argue that it was within the search for a sufficiently grandiose aesthetic that esports producers found in classical antiquity a rich source of inspiration in its epic warfare, its gladiatorial arenas, its mythological battles between gods and heroes, and in the well-established artistic tradition that captured all of these elements in highly visual terms. We'll turn first to the figure of the esports player, exploring how antiquity has been invoked by Riot Games in their attempt to fashion the esports player as a new mix of celebrity, athlete, hero, gladiator, and performer. So, playing in the background here is a trailer that Riot released last year to launch its Hall of Legends initiative, which is intended to celebrate their most accomplished esports players. Throughout the trailer, the camera pans in on each detail of this digitally rendered sculpture. Many commenters immediately associated this statue with Faker, who just last week became the game's only six-time world champion. A few months after this trailer was released, Faker was announced, to no one's surprise, as the first inductee to the Hall of Legends. And it is revealed that he gets his own separate statue. So interestingly, the statue in this particular video was meant to represent an imagined, non-specified archetypal figure of the esports player. Audiences are meant to view the celebration of League's top players in what we'd call a classicizing light, in a form deliberately imitative of Greek and Roman style. We see this from the pillars surrounding the statue and from the statue itself. The camera lingers on each of these reliefs, which is a form of carved sculpture laid against a background made up of the same material, such that the sculptures appear as if they're emerging from the rock. These reliefs form the base of the statue, depicting various characters from the game, as well as scenes of them battling against one another. Reliefs of this sort are common in ancient sculpted works. The image on the left shows a 4th century BCE sarcophagus celebrating the achievements of the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. It bears reliefs of historical and mythological narratives that scroll horizontally across its base, similar to the statue in the video. Likewise, in the image on the right, we have a continuous frieze wrapped all around the column of Marcus Aurelius, portraying the achievements of the Roman emperor general during his military campaigns in Germany. Seated at the very top of the column, depicting his greatest achievements, is a sculpture of Marcus Aurelius himself. Of course, there isn't a clear one-to-one gloss here, but placed side by side, we may start to get a sense of where some of Riot's inspiration for the design emerged. This merging of classicizing motifs does some symbolic work by overlaying the celebration of ancient military conquests onto the contemporary celebration of esports achievement. The resonances between these ancient and modern forms of commemoration isn't just restricted to visual elements, but they can take the form of spoken rhetoric as well. In this next bit, I aim to situate League's fast-paced gameplay and its esports commentatorship in dialogue with the equally hectic battle scenes we find in ancient epic poetry like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And together we'll analyze the deciding team fight of the World's 2024 finals between T1 and BLG. But before doing so, I wanted to get us into the frame of mind for viewing an esports match in epic terms. And this means paying attention to how in-game action is narrated by esports commentators to their live audience. There is, I think, a deeply bardic quality to what they're doing, and I find that as they use their words to translate hectic in-game action into immersive heroic narratives, whether consciously or otherwise, esports commentators actually incorporate many of the same techniques we find in Epic. Just like in a game of League, battle scenes in Epic can get quite messy. Take the scene from Homer's Odyssey. Here, Odysseus returns to his hometown of Ithaca, where he and his loyalists battle against the suitors in the Great Hall. Ancient Greek epic was designed to be performed as oral poetry, and that means that Homeric bards, much like esports commentators, would be reciting these battles to a live audience. When you have a large-scale battle going on with members on both sides throwing spears and getting hit all at the same time, trying to capture the chaos of battle in a way that's immersive might require a certain frantic style of narration. The audience needs to actually hear the speed of battle and the sense of everything happening all at once. Take, for instance, the sections highlighted in yellow. Odysseus and the other three on his side have all thrown spears, and immediately we get this concise, rapid-fire narration listing the four spear throwers and their four victims. Odysseus hit Ptolemy, Telemachus Euryades, the swineherd Elatus, and the cowherd Pisander. This omission of unnecessary syntax is already found in the original Greek and is used to reflect this pace of battle. In addition to this rapid narration, the second thing to keep in mind is the concept of Aristeia. In ancient epic, as well as in a lot of contemporary action movies, we often get this moment where the camera fixates on one of the characters as they start to really pop off in a moment of glory, taking down one enemy after another. One example of this is Achilles in the Iliad when Patroclus dies and he goes on this rampage through the Trojan army. In this short passage, we see here how the bard makes the choice to focalize the entire battle purely through the perspective of Achilles, describing in great detail how he slaughters these four men one after another. In epic, this is a standard technique used for singling out and celebrating its main heroes. Now, as we watch this clip from the World Finals, keep in mind both these elements from epic.
Players down there as well. That weight on your shoulders.
I'm nervous and I'm not even playing.
It's just monumental. It's not just you, it's not just your team, it's your fans, it's your family, it's your region that have supported you through thick and thin. And
Owner, very close here.
pressure on you, Shattering Strike going wide. Shun tries to dash across the wall, but immediately he's locked up, goes in with the Cataclysm. Gumayushi pops the Feather Storm. Owner looking to re-engage onto Shun down to half HP. Ben gets onto the back line. Gumayushi cleanses away, but Ben has already put him in the dirt. Kevin is next up. BLG find 2, T1 able to back away for the moment, but the TP behind by Ben as he looks for a little bit more. Oh, they go back in. Baker flashes in, and down goes Knight once again when you need someone, when you need anyone to stand up and show just what this game's all about. It's Faker. He finds another T155, and alongside it, the Baron in their eyes.
The hero's entrance was true to its name as Faker in T1's dire moments descends from the sky and T1 turned the fight in their favor.
The crown may be heavy, but it belongs to Faker.
Well, so that was the action-packed team fight that decided the entire World's 2024 championship. So setting aside that incredible and sort of passionate commentary for just a moment, instead, let's try to conceptualize the in-game battle at its most reductive form. If you've watched interviews with pro league players, including Faker, you might hear them discuss just how mathematically they visualize the game. Many talk about how every exchange between two characters essentially boils down to a clash of numbers, which comes from, adding up the multipliers from each character's active and passive abilities, throw in a couple of basic attacks, and then factor into the equation the levels, items, and stats of both characters. Taking the game at this raw level of code, the scene we watched could be distilled into a rapid series of interactions between hitboxes, skill shots, and numbers. But when it comes to selling the story of an esports match, however, the graphics, art, and skill animations of the game start to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But even then, for the onlooker of the scene, this scene just often remains a kind of disorganized visual chaos. It can be hard to decipher who does what, to whom, and when. And much like the rapid-fire narration from the Odyssey, we heard something very similar at the beginning of the clash in the commentators' equally rapid-fire account of spells that hit or miss their mark. But at the turning point when T1 sort of chose to re-engage, what we got was nothing short of an Aristeia. All of a sudden, every single thing that the commentators had to say had to do with Faker. Clearly, focalizing the reigning world champion was a convenient narrative thread they knew they could pull on to generate hype and to transform this hectic clash between 10 players into a singular heroic narrative about one. Moving away from the world of Greek epic to ancient Rome, let's talk about the arena. So since online gaming became a thing, even the word arena has become quite synonymous with competitive play. Many games that are mainly cooperative often have an arena mode where PvP becomes the focus, showing its adoption even at the linguistic level within UI and game systems. For esports especially, the gladiatorial arena was an important reference point. After all, the combat-oriented gameplay of most competitive online games, combined with their fantasy historical elements, brings the analogy of gladiatorial combat closer than it's ever been. The biggest esports events today tend to take place in huge, multi-purpose event venues. In the months leading up to the event, they are refitted with advanced technologies, giant LED screens, lighting, pyrotechnics, and carefully produced visuals that play all around. For Worlds 2017, Riot's esports production team had an augmented reality dragon projected during their opening ceremony. The Romans likewise reserved some of their most advanced technologies for the arena, elevators that lifted wild animals from the pit directly up to the arena floor, and zones that could be flooded to recreate naval battles, like depicted in Gladiator 2. While the sharks in the film might seem quite ridiculous, there are more than enough historical accounts that do mention that these displays took place. Both then and now, the arena was always meant to represent a space of technological marvel, an ambition which esports has certainly brought to its live broadcast spectacles. This refashioning of esports as digitized gladiatorial combat isn't just about the physical arena itself, but in all of the paratext that is produced to market these competitions. Somewhere in Pompeii, because it was buried in ash after the eruption, archaeologists have managed to find some well-preserved gladiatorial graffiti. The picture on the left shows what the graffiti actually looks like, which can be hard to make sense of, but by tracing the grooves and etchings in the stone, however, archaeologists have reproduced the recreation we see on the right. The image and text advertises a gladiatorial contest taking place in the town of Nola, singling out 3 celebrity gladiators who are going to fight in the games. Sometimes fans of the arena wanted more intricate and immersive depictions, and they wanted them at home. Here we have a mosaic taken from a Roman villa in Germany. Each panel depicts a different spectacle from the arena, some involving fights of animals, some between humans, and the bottommost panel depicts combat between 2 different classes of gladiators. Even back then, there was something about the arena that could capture the visual imagination of arena goers. For comparison, I'm now going to show an example of gladiatorial paratext put out by League. Even though it might look a little different from these much more tactile ancient examples, a lot of the same principles apply. So playing in the background here is one of League's cinematic music videos, Awaken, released in 2019. Stretched out over the course of the cinematic are 3 different scenes of conflict between various pairings of playable characters, interspersed so that all 3 arcs culminate one after another in a visually satisfying clash at the end. The 3 settings, a performance hall, a gladiatorial arena, and a battlefield, more or less capture the new set of inspirational frames for esports, much like if we were trying to imagine a corporate vision board for what modern esports could be. The gladiatorial scene is set in an arena in Noxus, the game's dark fantasy take on the Roman Empire, between Riven, an imperial defector, and Draven, a star gladiator. At the very end, the cinematic lingers on a climactic final scene in which the characters are about to trade fully winded swings. Within the context of a competitive esports title like League, these unresolved clashes between playable characters activates not only a sense of suspense, but of direct embodiment. The implication is simple. As players compete in the game, they vicariously enact a gladiatorial fantasy through embodied control over these characters. Skilled control over mouse and keyboard is staged as a proxy for mastery with a sword, bow, or whatever the character's weapon of choice is. These highly visual depictions of combat assist the player in overcoming the gap of the imagination, the gap between the embodied aspects of play as they sit in front of the computer screens for hours at end, to the vivid conflicts of might and magic that are staged within the game itself. This construction of competitive play as a form of gladiatorial combat comes across even more overtly in the second of two cinematics released each year for League. Whereas the season cinematic, like Awaken, takes the form of CGI production featuring in-game characters and scenes from the game's diegetic universe, the World's Anthem cinematic uses cel-shaded anime-style graphics to represent actual esports players battling it out via some form of embodied control, most often with players wielding the weapons of their signature characters. While they adopt different aesthetics, both forms of cinematic musical paratext work together to drive home the embodied gladiatorial aspects of competitive play, invoking classical antiquity in order to legitimize and market the pursuit of professional esports. And with that, I reached the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
That was absolutely perfect timing, Kevin. You are right at 6:20. And we already have a question for you in the chat that says, how did you get involved in this research?
Oh, that's a really great question. I mean, I guess I was a gamer before I was a classicist, and I just really let my passions guide the stuff that I was interested in. Um, I grew up in Singapore, where I suppose esports and online gaming was just really popular, and I had only come into, encountered Greek and Roman literature somewhere in college, and you know something just connected. It's like, oh shit, all the sorry, don't know if I'm supposed to say that. Between the games and the hobbies and the sort of online worlds that fascinated me so much, and this literature that clearly was the cornerstone of all of that kind of literary and narrative and world building thought. And I sort of just went down that rabbit hole. And today, as I do my PhD, it's just a lot of interdisciplinary work between what's happening in tech, what's happening in media, what's happening in video games, and how does that connect to the kind of aesthetic and literary worlds of antiquity.
And another question has come in. Do you think the imagery used by casters is deliberately used for cultural legitimacy as well? And they continue, it's worth thinking about how we're analyzing Western League here, which does take an image of
Yeah.
legitimacy, history, or epics from the classics in ways that help with the vision of mainstreaming.
Oh,
And
for
they end with,
sure.
do you think the Korean ecosystem uses the same tools?
Mhm. Oh, that's a really, really fascinating question, and one that I'm hoping to explore a bit more in my dissertation research that I've just sort of started. So definitely with Western League, I think, in a lot of the esports matches that I've watched, the sort of language of blood sport, language of, heroism, especially from the classical tradition, I think I hear it so often that, I can't help but notice the kind of classicism that underlies esports commentatorship in the West. I am curious as to how much of it is translating over to the East, however. I mean, because we know that South Korea and China are, sort of such dominant forces in competitive gaming these days, but clearly there's a kind of different linguistic tradition that's going on. And yet, there are these moments of overlap, like with the Hall of Legends initiative, where, the first two inductees to the Hall, and who have these classicizing statues made of them are Faker and Uzi. And so, we do see this kind of cultural assimilation of East and West within esports. And that's part of the fascination for me that I'm excited to get more into.
And I have a question to add here. This might be a little bit of my
Please.
bias being at Michigan State University, where, of course, the Spartans are our logo. But you said in your presentation that you see esports turning to classics for inspiration rather than to traditional sports. But I guess I would ask, is what you're seeing perhaps a continuation of what some traditional sports organizations have also been doing to emphasize competition
Yeah.
and this kind of gladiator style? Or do you see it as more distinct than that rather than a continuation of existing trends?
Oh, for sure. I think it's a complicated question because I think, as I mentioned, the kind of abridged media history at the beginning, I think sort of physical sports got there a lot sooner than, any kind of sort of bigger sort of historical thinking about what esports could be. And so, I know a lot of existing research has been in terms of that connection between esports and traditional sports. Part of this research is to sort of, to expand that a little bit, bring in sort of history and antiquity into the conversation. But I think it's much easier as you put it to sort of talk about it as a kind of continuation. And I think with contemporary esports, we are seeing this blend of very sort of sporting imagery, the jerseys that are still being worn, and yet this fusion of the classical as part of the aesthetics of it. And yeah, esports is just it's a site of fusion in all these different ways.
Excellent. Well, we've got just about a minute left. Kevin, is there any final wrap-up point you would like to give us to end your presentation today?
Oh, well, not really. Just, I mean, I know this is the last sort of content presentation of the entire conference, and just on behalf of my fellow presenters and people watching at home, thank you to you and all the other organizers for making this possible.
Thank you so much. I'm going to use that to transition into saying, don't go anywhere, anyone. We are about to move into a very brief break, but we will be back for the closing remarks of the Esports Research Network Conference 2025, sponsored by Corsair for Business. And we're really looking forward to all of you being here to hear what's coming up next in the conference. So thank you again, Kevin, for sharing your research. And we'll see all of you back here in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Bye.